Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back in time, not just to any dynasty, but to the Tang dynasty, specifically to the court of the one and only female emperor in Chinese history, Wu Zetian. But here's the catch. You're not going as a tourist with a return ticket. You're going as a new palace attendant, and your first objective is simply to survive the first day. The world you're about to enter is a dazzling paradox. On the one hand, it's the cosmopolitan heart of a golden age, a place where art, poetry, and fashion flourish. On the other hand, the palace itself is a gilded cage of lethal etiquette, where a wrong step or a careless word could be your last. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You have arrived. Welcome to the late 7th century Tang dynasty, China's golden age. After passing through layers of selection, you've become a low-ranking palace attendant, assigned to the heart of imperial power. The palace city in the divine capital, Luoyang. Before you truly step through that massive, vermilion lacquered palace gate, the city of Luoyang in your eyes is a vibrant, dazzling scroll of life. This city was one of the largest metropolises in the world at the time, with a population that may have exceeded 1 million. As the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, it gathered rare treasures and people of all colors from around the globe. On the streets, you can see Persian merchants leading camels, the scent of spices you've never smelled before wafting from their shops. Monks from India and Tibet, dressed in foreign robes, walk by with solemn expressions. There are even Jewish merchants and Nestorian missionaries, all finding their place in this inclusive city. You see those noble women of the Tang dynasty, not as secluded as you imagined. They wear daring, low-cut dresses and some even sport men's nomadic-style clothing, riding tall horses and playing a fierce sport called polo on the wide streets. It's said that even the current sovereign, Wu Zetian, is a polo master. The men are not to be outdone. Some scholars and artists even have flowers pinned in their hair, a fashionable statement of elegance at the time. The entire city is immersed in an atmosphere of openness, confidence, and even a bit of luxury. You even hear people say that the modern Chinese term for shopping, mai dong xi, literally buy east-west, originates from the two massive markets in the Tang capital, the East Market and the West Market, because they contained almost every commodity imaginable. However, when you finally, with a nervous heart, follow the elderly eunuch leading the way and step over that high threshold into the daeming palace, the entire world changes in an instant. The hustle and bustle of the outside world is completely shut out, replaced by a suffocating silence. The air is filled with a mixture of expensive incense and the scent of repeatedly polished wooden beams. Your footsteps echo harshly on the mirror-smooth stone slabs. Everything here follows an invisible but omnipresent set of rules, a code of court etiquette that is a matter of life and death. The eunuch leading you barely glances at you, only observing you from the corner of his eye. His voice as dry and rustling as autumn leaves. Remember this, newcomer. Here, keep your eyes open and your mouth shut. Walk along the sides, never in the middle of the path. That's reserved for the Son of Heaven. When entering or leaving a room, don't stand in the center of the doorway. That's disrespectful to your superiors. He pauses, as if recalling something terrible. And never, ever make a sound when you're not supposed to. Every morning at Mao Shi, between 5 and 7, the officials have to wait outside the hall for the morning audience. They must stand motionless for hours, no matter the wind or snow. I've seen an official, rushing to court before dawn, misstep and drown in the moat. I've also heard of a minister who couldn't help but cough in the emperor's presence and had a month's salary docked. You? A newcomer like you? If you make a mistake, it won't be as simple as losing a month's pay. You lower your head, not daring to speak, a chill running down your spine. You start to notice the details. The palace windows are not glass, as you might have imagined, but paper or silk stretched over wooden lattices. In more refined halls, the window paper is soaked in oil to make it more translucent. In more luxurious ones, dyed silk is used, so the light filtering through tints the entire room in a soft hue. You also catch a glimpse of the pillows used by the palace ladies. Not soft cotton pillows, but hard porcelain or wooden ones with a groove just right for cradling the back of the head. This, you learn, is to protect their elaborate hairstyles, which can take hours to create. You also smell a peculiar fragrance, not of flowers or incense. A passing palace maid has a delicate sachet hanging from her waist, emitting a faint, sweet scent as she moves. You later learn that Tang people didn't use spray perfumes, but wore these sachets filled with fragrant spices. To keep their breath fresh, they would chew on honeyed green olives or simply hold a clove in their mouth. Even bathing was a ritual. They used ancient bath bombs made of aloes wood, frankincense, sandalwood, camphor, and chrysanthemum to soak in, leaving their bodies naturally fragrant. You look at this magnificent, rule-bound Basirant, then think of the free-spirited, colorful city of Luoyang outside, and a huge sense of disconnect washes over you. You begin to understand that the golden age of the Tang dynasty was perhaps not as simple as the books described. You see those noble women riding horses and playing polo, their freedom and confidence making you envious. But was this truly the norm for all women at the time? Or was it a privilege reserved for a small elite? Historians are still debating this issue today. Some argue that the Tang dynasty was indeed a period when women's status was at its highest in Chinese history, with a relatively open social atmosphere. But others point out that this freedom was limited to the imperial and aristocratic classes. For ordinary women struggling at the bottom, like you, the Confucian 3 obediences and 4 virtues were still an insurmountable shackle. Looking at the cautious, silent palace maids within these walls, you have your own answer. You take a deep breath. The air is still thick with that complex scent of power and fragrance. You know that from this day forward, your life is no longer your own. You must learn to observe, to be silent, and to survive in the most splendid and dangerous place on earth. Your luck isn't too bad. After a period of menial work, your nimble hands and quiet nature get you transferred to a side hall not far from the Empress's living quarters. This gives you the chance one evening, from a great distance, to catch your first glimpse of the legendary woman, Wu Zetian. She is nearly 70, but from afar, her posture is still erect. She wears the yellow dragon robe that only an emperor can wear, ascending the palace steps surrounded by a retinue of officials. At that moment, you feel the air in the entire palace freeze. You don't dare to look up, only sensing an invisible, awe-inspiring presence from the corner of your eye. you begin to hear all sorts of rumors about this female emperor, both true and false, from the older attendants around you. They say her life is a legend, written with ambition and wisdom. She entered the palace at 14, initially just an inconspicuous Chiron, talented lady, among Emperor Taizong Li Shimin's many concubines. Emperor Taizong gave her the name Wu Mei, later known as Wu Meiniang. After Taizong's death, according to custom, all childless concubines were to be sent to the Ganye temple to live out their days as nuns. But she broke this fate. Taizong's son, the newly enthroned Emperor Gaozong Li Ji, had been infatuated with her when he was still the crown prince. He brought her back from the temple to the palace, making her his Zhaoyi, a high-ranking concubine. The story that follows has been told in countless versions within the palace, each filled with intrigue and bloodshed. The old attendants whispered to you that, to ascend to the throne of Empress, she eliminated all her rivals one by one. The most famous and horrifying tale is about the death of her own daughter. It is said that in 654, her newborn daughter died. She insisted that the childless Empress Wang, out of jealousy, had smothered the infant while she was away. The grief-stricken Emperor Gaozong believed her, eventually deposing Empress Wang and consigning her to the cold palace. Soon after, Wu Zetian became the new empress, as she had wished. Would she really kill her own daughter for the throne? You can't help but whisper to an older palace maid. The maid glances around nervously, shakes her head quickly, then nods, leaving you even more confused. This is the cold case that historians have debated for over 1,000 years. Traditional Confucian historians, like the authors of the Old Book of Tang and the Ziji Tongjian, almost unanimously portray her as a vicious woman who would stop at nothing for power. They believe she killed her own daughter and framed Empress Wang. However, many modern scholars have raised doubts. They argue that, in an era with poor medical conditions, infant mortality, what we might call sudden infant death syndrome today, was very common. Perhaps it was just an unfortunate accident that the shrewd Wu Zetian seized upon, turning it into the perfect weapon to topple her political rival. The truth? It's likely no one will ever know. What you can be sure of is that from the moment she became Empress, her path to power was unstoppable. Emperor Gaozong was frail and, in his later years, suffered from severe wind disease, possibly a stroke, rendering him unable to handle state affairs. Starting from 660, Wu Zetian began to rule from behind the curtain, sitting behind a screen behind the emperor and handling state affairs with him. They were known as the Two Saints, but everyone knew there was only one true saint. Emperor Gaozong passed away in 683. As Empress Dowager, she successively placed her two sons, Li Xian, Zhongzong, and Li Dan, Ruizong, on the throne, only to quickly depose them for various reasons. She ruled in their names until 690, when she felt the time was ripe. She deposed her son, ascended the throne herself, changed the dynasty's name to Zhou, and established her capital in Luoyang, renaming it Shendu, divine capital. She became the only legitimate female emperor in Chinese history. However, standing in this palace, you feel not only the splendor of her power, but also her profound loneliness. You see the ministers surrounding her, outwardly respectful and shouting, "Long live the emperor!" But from the occasional flicker in their eyes, you can read deep-seated contempt and disdain. For these scholar officials, steeped in Confucian ideology, a woman ruling the world was a perversion of nature, a disruption of yin and yang. You hear an old Hanlin academician, drunk, muttering a line allegedly from a minister's memorial. Your Majesty occupies the yang position with a female body, reversing the hard and soft. Thus, the Earth's chi is blocked. They even interpreted a small mountain that appeared after an earthquake as the Earth roaring in anger under the oppression of yin energy. Wu Zetian knew all this, of course. She used an iron fist to suppress all opposition, establishing a secret police system and using cruel officials to eliminate the Li Tang imperial family and those veteran ministers who refused to submit. But this high pressure only brought superficial obedience, not heartfelt allegiance. You watch her walk alone down the empty palace corridors, her shadow stretched long by the setting sun. You suddenly feel that this woman at the pinnacle of power is perhaps the loneliest person in the world. She has no truly trustworthy partners, no family to rely on. Her own relatives were either eliminated by her or were mediocre people she looked down upon. Everyone around her is a potential enemy. Surrounded by this extreme insecurity and loneliness, she began to build a power circle completely loyal to and dependent on her in her own way. This, perhaps, is the real reason her controversial male favorites appeared on the stage of history. They were not simple playmates. They were her weapons against the entire world. You also discover an interesting detail. To consolidate her authority, this female emperor even created some new Chinese characters, such as the character Zhao, Zhao for her name, with Ming, bright, on top, and Kong, sky below, meaning the sun and moon in the sky, illuminating the earth. These Zetian characters, though quickly abandoned after her abdication, became a unique mark of her one-of-a-kind reign. She also decreed that the mourning period for a father and a mother should be of equal length, which was a shocking reform in a society that considered the father as heaven. And it revealed her clear intention to elevate the status of women. The story begins at the bustling markets of Luoyang. One day, you are sent out of the palace on an errand, and, in a corner of the West Market, you see a man who leaves a deep impression on you. His name is Feng Xiaobao, a peddler selling medicine on the street. He is burly, muscular, with a booming voice, boasting to the surrounding crowd about how miraculous his homemade ointment is. Unlike the refined officials in the palace, he has a wild, vibrant energy that attracts a large audience. At the time, you just see him as an interesting character from the marketplace and soon forget about him. But not long after, an unbelievable piece of gossip starts circulating in the palace. People say that Feng Xiaobao, the street peddler, has caught the eye of the emperor's aunt, Princess Qianjin. The princess found this energetic man very interesting and recommended him to her mother, the current Empress Dowager, Wu Zetian. At that time, Wu Zetian had just lost her husband, Emperor Gaozong. Although she held great power, she was lonely in the deep palace and constantly had to guard against treacherous political enemies. Feng Xiaobao's appearance was like a gust of coarse, fresh wind blowing into her suppressed life. The history books say that Empress Wu was pleased with him. But a problem arose. How could a common street peddler frequently enter and exit the heavily guarded imperial palace? Wu Zetian came up with a brilliant solution. She ordered Feng Xiaobao to be tonsured and become a monk, giving him the name Huaiyi. This way, he could enter the palace at any time under the guise of a monk to preach the Dharma. This was undoubtedly using religion as a cover to provide a legitimate facade for a private relationship. You soon see this newly promoted Master Huaiyi in the palace. He has shed his coarse cloth garments for a magnificent monk's robe. But the untamable spirit in his eyes has not diminished in the slightest. To further elevate his status, Wu Zetian did something that stunned the entire court. She ordered her daughter Princess Taiping's husband, her son-in-law Shui Shao, to formally recognize Shui Huaiyi as an uncle in his clan. A humble street vendor, overnight, became the uncle of the imperial son-in-law. This was an utter absurdity. You see the expressions of disdain and shock on the faces of the officials from noble families. But no one dares to openly object. Why did Wu Zetian do this? Was it simply out of loneliness, to find a companion? When you see what Shui Huaiyi does in the palace, you begin to understand that things are far from simple. He is not just a male favorite. He is more like a weapon, carefully chosen by Wu Zetian to challenge and intimidate the old order. He came from the grassroots with no political background, which meant that all his status and glory came from the Empress's grace. He could only be absolutely loyal to her. He was crude and arrogant, ignorant of the palace's elaborate etiquette, which was perfect for clashing with the rule-bound, aristocratic officials who looked down on her from the bottom of their hearts. You watch Shui Huaiyi swaggering through the palace, and a chill runs through you. This man is like a giant stone thrown by the Empress into the stagnant pool of the court, destined to create massive waves. And that, perhaps, is exactly what she wants. The relationship between Wu Zetian and her favorites has always been a subject of great controversy among historians. Take Shui Huaiyi, for example. Later Confucian historians always depicted their relationship as purely carnal and licentious, using it to attack Wu Zetian's absurd and shameless later years. They delighted in describing how Shui Huaiyi committed debauchery within the palace, satisfying the desires of an elderly woman. Huever, many historians believe this view is too simplistic and stereotypical. They point out that Shui Huaiyi played multiple roles at the time. He was indeed the Empress's lover, but he was also an important political enforcer and a religious agent. In her later years, Wu Zetian vigorously promoted Buddhism to counter the Li Tang imperial family, who revered Taoism. As the abbot of the White Horse Temple, Shui Huaiyi was a key figure in her policy of promoting Buddhism. He was responsible for overseeing the construction of grand imperial buildings like the Mingtang and Tiantang, which was in itself a major political task. So, was he a lover, a thug, or a religious puppet? Perhaps he was all three. And this complexity precisely reflects Wu Zetian's masterful and pragmatic approach to using people. What she needed was never a simple companion, but a multifunctional tool that could be used by her and help her consolidate power. Shui Huaiyi, the former street peddler, was now the most sought-after figure in the palace. You often saw him riding an imperial horse, charging recklessly through the palace grounds, followed by a dozen young eunuchs. Everyone who saw him, whether they were palace maids, eunuchs, or low-ranking officials, would quickly get out of his way, afraid of provoking this tyrant. He had a habit. If he disliked someone, or if they got too close, he would not hesitate to swing his whip, beating them until they were bruised and bloody, then tossing them aside like trash. He particularly hated Taoist priests. This was perhaps because his master, Wu Zetian, was vigorously promoting a policy of revering Buddhism and suppressing Taoism. Whenever he encountered Taoist priests on the road, he would harass them in every possible way, from a severe beating to forcibly shaving their heads, humiliating them to the extreme. His power was so immense that even Wu Zetian's two powerful nephews, Wu Sanxi, the Prince of Liang, and Wu Chengxi, the Prince of Wei, had to kowtow to him respectfully. Sui Huaiyi also recruited a group of street ruffians, had them all tonsured as monks, and they effectively became his private guard. This group of monk soldiers ran amok in the divine capital of Luoyang, and few officials dared to intervene. But there was always an exception. Once, a supervising censor named Feng Sixu refused to be intimidated and lawfully punished several of Shui Huaiyi's followers. When Shui Huaiyi found out, he blocked Feng Sixu on the road and ordered his men to give him a severe beating, nearly killing the censor. However, even such an arrogant and domineering person once met his match. It was a widely circulated palace anecdote. One day, outside the court, Shui Huaiyi encountered the chancellor, Su Liangxi. Relying on the Empress's favor, he held his head high and ignored the chancellor. But Su Liangxi was a seasoned imperial minister who had weathered many storms. He was not about to tolerate this upstart's insolence. He immediately flew into a rage and ordered his guards, "Seize this bald donkey for me." The guards swarmed forward, held Shui Huaiyi down, and Su Liangxi personally stepped up and slapped him dozens of times. Shui Huaiyi, dizzy and disoriented, ran crying to Wu Zetian to complain. Everyone expected the Empress to be furious and severely punish the chancellor. To their surprise, after hearing the story, Wu Zetian simply said to Shui Huaiyi, "You were in the wrong. The southern palace is where the chancellors discuss state affairs. You shouldn't go there unless you have business. If you want to enter the palace, use the north gate." With one sentence, she both placated her favorite and preserved the chancellor's dignity and the court's rules, displaying her superb political wisdom. This incident also made everyone understand that Shui Huaiyi's power was ultimately built on the shifting sands of the Empress's favor and could collapse at any moment. He did indeed perform great services for Wu Zetian. Under her direction, he supervised the construction of the Mingtang and Tiantang, which symbolized imperial power in the center of the universe. The Mingtang, in particular, stood nearly 90 meters tall, making it the tallest wooden structure in the world at the time, its magnificence enough to inspire awe in all who saw it. After the project was completed, Wu Zetian made him the Duke of Liang and showered him with countless rewards. But power and desire eventually consumed him. As Wu Zetian grew older, she began to favor another, more professional lover, the imperial physician Shen Nanqiu. Unlike the crude Shui Huaiyi, the imperial physician was gentle and considerate, better at caring for an elderly person's health. Shui Huaiyi felt an unprecedented sense of neglect and jealousy. On a night in 695, blinded by jealousy, he did something insane. He set fire to the Tiantang, the very building he had personally supervised, which had cost countless lives and resources. The fire also spread to the adjacent Mingtang. The two buildings, symbols of the glory of the Wuzhou dynasty, were reduced to ashes overnight. Afterward, although Wu Zetian did not severely punish him on the surface and even put him in charge of the reconstruction, her disgust and wariness of him had reached their peak. This tool had gone out of control, becoming a sharp blade that could harm her. She began to make secret arrangements, selecting a group of strong palace maids as her bodyguards. Finally, one night, she summoned Shui Huaiyi to the Yaoguang Hall under a pretext. Inside, her nephew Wu Yuning and his elite troops were already in ambush. As soon as Shui Huaiyi entered, the soldiers sprang up and beat him to death with clubs. His body received no honors. It was quietly taken to the White Horse Temple and hastily cremated. It is said that his ashes were eventually mixed with mud to build a pagoda. This once arrogant man's final resting place was to become dust, trodden under the feet of thousands of believers. Historians have different views on his death. Some believe he brought it upon himself, executed for arson and arrogance. But others think it was more like a carefully planned purge. Wu Zetian may have long wanted to get rid of this increasingly uncontrollable favorite, and his act of arson simply gave her the perfect excuse. His death marked the end of the first phase of Wu Zetian's favorite strategy, and set the stage for the next, more refined and dangerous group of favorites to appear. The era of Shui Huaiyi ended in a tragic yet inevitable way. But while he was at the height of his power, a new, mysterious institution had quietly been established in the palace, the Konghe Fu. You first heard this name from an elderly, well-read eunuch. He told you that the words Konghe had a significant origin. It came from a Taoist tale about an immortal named Wang Zijin, who controlled a crane, Konghe, to ascend to heaven and achieve immortality. You immediately understood that the name was brilliantly chosen. It wrapped what could have been seen by the outside world as a male harem in a mystical cloak of seeking longevity and immortality. This perfectly catered to the aging Wu Zetian's obsession with eternal life and auspicious signs. For the pedantic Confucian ministers, they could attack the Empress for debauchery. But it was difficult to directly attack her pursuit of longevity, as this was something emperors throughout history had done. It was a perfect act of political branding. So, who were the people in this Konghe Fu? You quietly observed and found that those selected were far more than just handsome young men. Among them were talented poets, learned scholars, and of course eloquent sycophants skilled in flattery. For instance, the later famous great poets Song Jiwen and Du Shenyun were once members of the Konghe Fu. It was like the Empress's private think tank and literary salon. You gradually saw the true function of the Konghe Fu. It was by no means just a place to satisfy the Empress's personal desires. It had at least 3 important political functions. First, it was a parallel court. In the formal court, Wu Zetian faced a group of officials always ready to admonish or even criticize her with grand Confucian principles. But in the Konghe Fu, she could completely relax, discussing literature, art, and Taoist metaphysics with these people who depended on her, enjoying a purely monarch-subject relationship free from judgment. This was her comfort zone, and a place where her informal decisions were brewed. Second, it was a new talent reserve and power center. Wu Zetian knew that to counter the entrenched old ministers of the Li Tang, and the Guanlong aristocratic clique, she had to promote and appoint a group of newcomers completely loyal to her. The Konghe Fu was a perfect platform. Its members, regardless of their background, could rise to great heights and gain immense political influence if they won her favor. This bypassed the traditional bureaucratic selection system controlled by aristocratic families, creating a team of confidants who answered only to her. Third, it was an intelligence gathering center. The members of the Konghe Fu could freely enter and exit the palace. Their eyes and ears spread throughout the court and beyond. They could hear and see much information that formal officials could not access. This information, whether it was the private discussions of ministers or the whispers of the common people, would be collected and delivered to the Empress's desk. This allowed her to more accurately grasp the pulse of the empire and guard against any potential threats. You looked at the young officials chatting and laughing in the Konghe Fu, dressed in magnificent clothes and behaving elegantly. A stark contrast to the crude Shui Huayi. You realized that Wu Zetian's ruling techniques were becoming more mature and complex. She was no longer satisfied with using a blunt instrument like Shui Huayi to strike at the world. She was learning to use a sharper, more delicate scalpel. Of course, the debate among historians about the nature of the Konghe Fu has never ceased. The traditional view always portrays it as a place of filth and debauchery, ironclad proof of the Empress's licentiousness in her later years. But more and more scholars are challenging this view. They argue that simply defining the Konghe Fu as a male-favored concentration camp underestimates Wu Zetian's political wisdom. It was a complex institution that combined a private secretariat, a literary salon, an intelligence agency, and a political tool. Its very existence was a bold political experiment by Wu Zetian to consolidate her personal authority and counter the traditional bureaucratic system. As for the romantic stories, how much was fact, and how much was malicious exaggeration and fabrication by her political enemies to discredit her? This is likely another historical mystery. But in any case, the establishment of the Konghe Fu marked the beginning of Wu Zetian systematically building her own power core, independent of the traditional court. And the next masters of this core were about to make their entrance. After Shui Huayi's jealous flames burned down the Mingtang and Tiantang, they also consumed the last bit of favor he held in the Empress's heart, sealing his fate. As a palace attendant, you couldn't witness the bloody scene inside the Yaoguang Hall, but you could clearly feel the tense and fearful atmosphere. That night, the palace was heavily guarded. You only heard a distant commotion and faint screams, followed by a return to silence. The next day, everyone in the palace was tight-lipped, but their faces showed lingering fear. Soon the news quietly spread. Shui Huayi was dead, not from illness, not by accident, but beaten to death by soldiers led by Wu Yuning inside the hall. His body was carried out of the palace overnight and taken to the White Horse Temple, the place where he had once been the abbot and enjoyed immense prestige. But this time, he was not greeted by kneeling believers, but by a raging fire. He was hastily cremated, his ashes mixed with mud to build a pagoda. The Empress, in an extremely cold and decisive manner, announced to everyone, an era had ended. The first favorite she had personally propped up was also personally destroyed by her. She could give you everything, and she could take it all away in an instant. Shui Huayi's death left a power vacuum in the palace and a flurry of whispers. People were speculating who the next lucky one would be. The answer was revealed soon enough, and in a dramatic fashion. This time, the recommender was someone no one in the palace dared to cross. Princess Taiping, Wu Zetian's most beloved youngest daughter. Princess Taiping, like her mother, was intelligent, decisive, and politically ambitious. She recommended a young man named Zhang Changzong to her mother. It was said that Zhang Changzong was in his 20s, handsome, skilled in music, and elegant in his demeanor. Wu Zetian summoned him and was indeed very pleased. But a bigger surprise was yet to come. During his first audience, Zhang Changzong behaved both obediently and cleverly. He said to the Empress, "Your Majesty's favor is something I dare not accept. In fact, my elder brother, Zhang Yiji, surpasses me in both learning and appearance, and he is more proficient in the art of alchemy and medicine. Oh? Wu Zetian's interest was piqued. In her later years, she was obsessed with Taoist health practices and alchemy, hoping to achieve immortality. Zhang Changzong's words hit the mark perfectly. She immediately ordered Zhang Yiji to be summoned to the palace. And so, you witnessed a rare scene in court history. A pair of brothers simultaneously becoming the favorites of the supreme ruler. Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong quickly replaced Xue Huaiyi, and they were even better at it. The first time you saw the brothers, you immediately understood how different they were from Xue Huaiyi. If Xue Huaiyi was a rampaging tiger, the Zhang brothers were a pair of graceful cranes. They had fair skin, handsome features, and even wore light makeup on their faces, dressed in magnificent brocade robes, like figures from a painting. They didn't intimidate others with brute force like Xue Huaiyi, but with a softer, more refined approach. They quickly captured the Empress's heart. Why did Wu Zetian make such a choice? Was the shift from a crude macho man to a pair of delicate flower boys merely a change in personal taste? Historians have different interpretations. One view is that it reflected a change in Wu Zetian's ruling mentality. In Xue Huaiyi's time, she had just ascended the throne and her position was not yet stable. She needed a vicious dog like him to intimidate and eliminate political enemies for her. By the time the Zhang brothers appeared, her rule was quite stable, and the opposition in the court had been mostly purged. She no longer needed a simple enforcer, but companions who understood the pleasures of life and could provide emotional comfort and spiritual companionship. But another view suggests that this was a sign of her political skills becoming more mature. Xue Huaiyi's failure made her realize that pure violence and threats were unsustainable. She needed agents who were more skillful and knew how to navigate the complex ecosystem of the court. The Zhang brothers came from a family of officials, albeit minor ones, and understood the rules of the officialdom better than Xue Huaiyi. They could use more civilized methods to infiltrate and influence the court, achieving her political goals. Regardless, the appearance of the Zhang brothers marked the arrival of the Empress's favorite 2.0 era. They would push this path of temptation and danger to an unprecedented height. And you, as a witness to all this, would see how this magnificent palace became even more splendid and more bizarre because of their arrival. Between the Zhang brothers, the younger one, Zhang Changzong, seemed to be more favored by the Empress and was better at self-promotion. He soon acquired an elegant nickname in the palace, Liu Lang, or Sixth Son, as he was the sixth in his family. This name sounded both intimate and somewhat mysterious. But what truly elevated his status was a deification campaign meticulously planned by the palace's top echelons. You started hearing an incredible rumor quietly circulating in the palace. The source of this rumor was said to be the Empress's nephew, the powerful Wu Sanxi. He claimed that Zhang Changzong was not immortal, but the reincarnation of the Taoist immortal Wang Zijin. Wang Zijin was the crown prince of King Ling of Zhou, who, according to legend, played the sheng, a reed pipe instrument, to mimic the cry of a phoenix, and later rode a white crane to ascend to immortality between the Yi and Luo rivers. This story was widely known at the time. This claim was a stroke of political propaganda genius. First, it elevated Zhang Changzong's favor from a secular level to a sacred, fated one. He was not an ordinary male favorite, but an immortal descended to assist the Holy Mother and Divine Emperor. This provided a perfect supernatural explanation for Wu Zetian's unusual choice. Second, the legend of Wang Zijin, controlling a crane to become an immortal, perfectly echoed the name of the Konghe Fu, Palace of the Controlled Crane, further strengthening the institution's mystique and legitimacy. Thus began a grand court performance. Wu Sansi led the way, with all the civil and military officials singing praises and writing odes for this reincarnation of Wang Zijin. You saw those usually solemn chancellors and ministers now vying to praise Zhang Changzong with the most magnificent words, a scene both absurd and comical. The Empress herself was pleased with this development. You once personally heard her praise Zhang Changzong to those around her, saying his face is like a lotus flower. From then on, the beautiful name Lotus Liu Lang spread throughout the court. Observing this Lotus Liu Lang, you found he indeed had extraordinary qualities. His talent was not the brute force of large-scale construction like Shui Huaiyi's, but a soft power full of artistic flair. He was proficient in music and skilled in poetry. On those lazy afternoons, you often saw him with the Empress, admiring flowers, composing music, and exchanging poems in the palace gardens. He provided the aging Empress with something Shui Huaiyi could never give: spiritual resonance and aesthetic enjoyment. To some extent, he was more like a talented artistic companion than a simple lover. But if you thought he was just a harmless artistic youth, you were gravely mistaken. Zhang Changzong and his brother Zhang Yiji had an extremely keen political sense. They knew that their entire existence was built on the Empress's favor, and once she passed away, they would be left with nothing but a gruesome death. Therefore, they had to pave the way for their future while the Empress was still alive. Soon, they did something that impressed everyone. At that time, the issue of the heir to the throne was causing great controversy in the court. Wu Zetian once considered making her nephew Wu Chengxi the crown prince to ensure the Wu surname of the dynasty would continue. But this was strongly opposed by many ministers, led by Di Renjie. At this critical moment, the Zhang brothers intervened. They, along with another official trusted by the Empress, Ji Shu, repeatedly persuaded Wu Zetian. They told her that throughout history, only sons had built temples to worship their mothers. There was no precedent for a nephew building a temple for his aunt. If a Wu nephew were to be enthroned, who would offer sacrifices to Her Majesty for generations to come? This argument precisely hit Wu Zetian's deepest anxiety, her desire for posthumous fame and eternal worship. At the same time, they persuaded the imperial relatives who supported the Wu nephews, explaining the pros and cons. If you force your way to the throne, you will surely face fierce resistance from the old Li Tang ministers, and the world will fall into chaos again, which benefits no one. Under their internal and external maneuvering, Wu Zetian finally made a decision: to recall her exiled son Li Xian, the former emperor Zhongzong, to the capital and re-establish him as the crown prince. This move fully demonstrated the Zhang brothers' political wisdom. By supporting Li Xian, they not only showed goodwill to the old Li Tang ministers and eased hostility, but also made the future emperor owe them a huge favor, providing a crucial insurance policy for their future. Looking at the Lotus Liu Lang smiling sweetly beside the Empress, a chill ran down your spine. This man was far more complex and dangerous than his lotus-like face suggested. Of course, there is an enduring piece of gossip about the Zhang brothers, especially Zhang Changzong, that has persisted through the ages: their sexual orientation. Some modern interpretations, based on historical descriptions of them applying powder and rouge. Their effeminate demeanor, and the fact that the two brothers were inseparable, speculate that they might have been homosexual. There are even bolder claims that they might have been castrated before entering the palace, making them eunuchs. This view suggests their relationship with the aging Wu Zetian was more of a sexless, best friend type of companionship. However, traditional Confucian histories, in order to maximally vilify Wu Zetian, insisted they were her male favorites, repeatedly emphasizing how in her later years she had many favorites within the palace and was addicted to sensuality. What was the truth? What really happened between them and the Empress in her bedchamber? This has become a mystery that can never be confirmed. But one thing is certain. Whatever role they played, they stirred the political winds of the late Wu Zhou dynasty in an unprecedented way. As the Zhang brothers' position became increasingly secure, the mysterious Kong-he Fu was upgraded. In 700 AD, Wu Zetian officially ordered the Kong-he Fu to be renamed the Fengshen Fu, with the elder brother Zhang Yiji as the Fengshen Ling, the highest official of this institution. The change from Kong-he to Fengshen was significant. Kong-he carried a sense of Taoist immortal elegance and informality, while Fengshen, meaning to serve the monarch, sounded more like a formal, official palace institution. This was perhaps Wu Zetian's attempt to further legalize this private power center and integrate it more closely into the state system. The Fengshen Fu became the Zhang brothers' independent kingdom, a magnificent and extremely dangerous gilded cage. You watched their power reach its peak. They wore the most splendid clothes, used the finest objects, and had delicate makeup on their faces. Wherever they went, they were met with awe and reverence. The Empress's favor even extended to their family. Their mother was granted the title of Grande Dame, enjoying state guest-level treatment. Even more outrageously, on one occasion, the Empress ordered the Chancellor Li Jiangshu to become the lover of the Zhang brothers' mother. In the ancient officialdom, which valued etiquette and dignity, this was an unheard-of humiliation. But it also showed everyone once again the immense power of the Zhang brothers. To give them a legitimate reason to stay in the palace 24/7, Wu Zetian issued another decree, ordering the Zhang brothers, along with several great scholars, to compile a massive work titled Sanjiao Juying, Essence of Pearls from the Three Religions. This book aimed to collect the classics and essences of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Thus, the Fengshen Fu gained another layer of being a royal library and academic research institute. You often saw many scholars and literary men entering and leaving the Fengshen Fu, discussing academics with the Zhang brothers. But beneath this academic veneer lay burgeoning political ambition and ruthless power struggles. Soon, you witnessed the ruthlessness hidden beneath their delicate exteriors. In 701 AD, Wu Zetian's grandson, the son of Crown Prince Li Xian, Shao Wang Li Chonggrun, and his sister, Princess Yongtai, along with the princess's husband, Wu Yanji, Wu Zetian's grandnephew, privately discussed the Zhang brothers' monopoly on power and their chaotic administration. They might have thought it was just a small family complaint, harmless. But they underestimated the network of spies the Zhang brothers had in the palace. Their words soon reached Zhang Yiji's ears. He immediately embellished the story and reported to Wu Zetian, saying that the imperial grandson and princess were speaking ill of her behind her back and cursing her. For the aging, suspicious Wu Zetian, who most detested others discussing her private life, this crossed a line. She flew into a rage and ordered her own grandson, granddaughter, and grandnephew to be put to death. This incident shocked the entire court. People felt for the first time, so tangibly, that the Zhang brothers' power was great enough to easily decide the life and death of an imperial grandson. They were no longer just the Empress's playmates, but shadow emperors, who held the power of life and death. Their residence, the Fengshan Fu, had become a veritable hall of the underworld king for their political enemies. But you, as an observer at the center of the power vortex, smelled a whiff of destruction amidst this boundless favor. You discovered a fatal weakness in the Zhang brothers' power. It was entirely parasitic. It all stemmed from the favor of one person, the Empress, with no institutional, legal, or popular basis. They were like vines, clinging to a towering tree. They could climb high, but once the tree fell, they would be shattered to pieces. The more favored they were, the more enemies they made. The more they eliminated dissenters. The more they pushed those disgruntled officials and the Li Tang imperial family into the same camp. The Fengshan Fu, the institution that brought them supreme glory, was also becoming a target for all hatred and anger. You watched them enjoying their final carnival in the magnificent palace, as if you could already hear the sound of their graves being dug in the distance. Historians have long debated the role the Zhang brothers played in Wu Zetian's later years. Some historical sources, like the Ziji Tongjian, tend to believe that in her later years, Wu Zetian entrusted most state affairs to the Yiji brothers, suggesting they had become the de facto operators of the empire. But some scholars argue that this claim might have come from the officials who later launched a coup to overthrow them, with the intention of shifting blame and vilifying them. They believe that Wu Zetian, until the very end, firmly held the ultimate decision-making power. She was just physically weak and needed someone to handle daily affairs and convey her orders. The Zhang brothers were more like her senior secretaries and agents than true decision-makers. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. They became the focal point of all contradictions and conflicts in the late Wuzhou dynasty, and their fate was tightly bound to the fate of the dynasty itself. The undercurrents in the court grew more turbulent. Although Wei Yuanzhong was exiled, the opposition he represented did not disappear. It merely went dormant. Everyone understood that the future of the empire depended on one core issue: the succession. And at this critical juncture, a figure whose name you had long admired began to play his irreplaceable role. He was the chancellor praised by later generations as a divine detective, Di Renjie. Of course, the historical Di Renjie was not a detective busy solving cases all day. He was an outstanding statesman, renowned for his wisdom, integrity, and loyalty to the Tang dynasty. During the years Wu Zetian reigned as emperor, he was one of the few ministers who dared to speak frankly, yet earned the Empress's deep trust and respect. Wu Zetian even respectfully called him Guo Lao, state elder, never addressing him by his name to show her esteem. You heard from the old palace hands that Di Renjie's way of persuading Wu Zetian was an art of Eastern wisdom. At the time, the Empress was very hesitant about the succession. On one hand, she wanted to pass the throne to her nephews, like Wu Chengxi or Wu Sanxi, to ensure the continuation of the Zhou dynasty she had founded. On the other hand, she could not sever the maternal bond with her sons. While she was wavering, Di Renjie did not confront her with grand principles like Wei Yuanzhong. He used a softer, yet more lethal method, a psychological approach. Once, Wu Zetian told Di Renjie she had a dream about a giant parrot with both wings broken. She asked him what it portended. Di Renjie immediately knelt and replied, "Your Majesty, the Wu in Ying Wu, parrot, is a homophone for your surname, Wu. This parrot is you, and the two wings are your two sons, Li Xian, the Prince of Luling, and Li Dan, the Prince of Xiang. Now that they are both deposed and in exile, it is as if their wings are broken. If you reinstate them, your wings will be restored." This dream interpretation was a stroke of genius. It packaged a political issue into a divine prophecy, speaking directly to the heart of the superstitious Wu Zetian, who believed in auspicious signs. Next, Di Renjie played the family card. He asked Wu Zetian a soul-searching question. "Your Majesty, between an aunt and a nephew, and a mother and a son, who is closer? If you enthrone your son, after 1,000 autumns, he will set up a spirit tablet for you in the ancestral temple, allowing you to enjoy the sacrifices of future generations. But if you enthrone your nephew, have you ever heard of a nephew, after becoming emperor, inviting his aunt into the ancestral temple for worship?" This question completely broke down Wu Zetian's psychological defenses. As a ruler, what she cared about most, besides power in life, was posthumous glory and historical status. Di Renjie made her understand that only a son could guarantee her status as a mother would be eternally revered after her death. But Di Renjie's wisdom did not stop there. He knew that to accomplish this, persuading the Empress alone was not enough. He also had to win over another powerful faction in the palace, the Zhang brothers. If the Zhang brothers obstructed, the matter could still fail. So, Di Renjie sent his confidant, Ji Shu, to privately persuade Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong. Ji Shu's argument to the Zhang brothers was entirely from their own selfish perspective. He said, "You two gentlemen are currently in high favor. But have you thought about what will happen after the Empress passes away? Who will be your support then? If a Wu nephew becomes emperor, you will also be relatives by marriage. Will he tolerate you? You might end up with no place to be buried. But if you act now and help restore the Prince of Luling, Li Xian, he will be the future emperor. You will have done him a great service by enthroning him. In the future, how could he not be grateful to you and protect your wealth and status?" These words were a revelation to the Zhang brothers. They realized that supporting Li Xian was their only way to save themselves. So, they also began to advocate for returning the government to the sun in front of Wu Zetian. Thus, under Di Renjie's careful planning, the internal and external forces reached a consensus. In 698 AD, Wu Zetian finally made up her mind, secretly sending for her exiled son, Li Xian, and re-establishing him as the crown prince. Watching all this, you felt a surge of admiration for Di Renjie. He did not try to oppose the Empress's power with his own principles like Wei Yuanzhong. He chose to understand the Empress's desires and fears, and then perfectly combined his goal with her deepest need, the craving for immortal fame. He was not fighting. He was guiding. He used the softest method to achieve the most difficult political turn, preserving a glimmer of hope for the nearly overturned Tang dynasty. Of course, later Confucian historians always portrayed Di Renjie as an absolutely loyal minister who was in the Zhou court but with his heart in the Tang. A hero who single-handedly restored the Tang. But some historians believe this view is too simplistic. Di Renjie was first and foremost a clear-headed, pragmatic politician. His insistence on welcoming back Li Xian was perhaps not just out of loyalty to the Li Tang, but because he keenly foresaw that if the succession issue was not resolved, the empire would inevitably plunge into a bloody civil war between the Wu and Li clans upon Wu Zetian's death. Everything he did was to avoid greater turmoil and ensure a smooth transition for the empire. Whatever his motives, this maneuver was undoubtedly the most brilliant chapter of his political career and laid the decisive groundwork for the final curtain of the Wu Zhou dynasty. The air in the court grew increasingly tense. Although Wei Yuanzhong had been exiled, the opposition he represented had not vanished. It had merely gone underground. Everyone understood that the future of the empire hinged on a single, crucial issue: the heir. And at this critical moment, a figure whose name you had long admired began to play his indispensable role. He was the chancellor later revered as the divine detective, Di Renjie. Of course, the historical Di Renjie was not a detective busy solving cases all day. He was an exceptional statesman, known for his wisdom, integrity, and loyalty to the Tang dynasty. During Wu Zetian's reign, he was one of the few ministers who dared to speak his mind, yet still earned the Empress's deep trust and respect. Wu Zetian even addressed him honorifically as Guolao, state elder, never by his name, as a sign of respect. You heard from the old palace hands that Di Renjie's method of persuasion was an art of Eastern wisdom. At the time, the Empress was deeply conflicted about the succession. On one hand, she wished to pass the throne to her nephews, like Wu Chengxi or Wu Sanxi, to ensure the continuation of the Zhou dynasty she had founded. On the other hand, she could not sever the maternal bond with her sons. As she wavered, Di Renjie did not confront her with hard-line arguments as Wei Yuanzhong had. He used a softer, yet more lethal approach, a psychological one. Once, Wu Zetian told Di Renjie she had dreamt of a giant parrot with both its wings broken. She asked him what it signified. Di Renjie immediately knelt and replied, "Your Majesty, the Wu in Yingwu, parrot, is a homophone of your surname, Wu. The parrot is you, and its two wings are your two sons, Li Xian, the Prince of Luling, and Li Dan, the Prince of Xiang. Now that they are both deposed and in exile, it is as if their wings are broken. If you reinstate them, your wings will be restored." This interpretation of the dream was a stroke of genius. It framed a political issue as a divine prophecy, speaking directly to the heart of the superstitious Wu Zetian, who believed in auspicious signs. Next, Di Renjie played the family card. He asked Wu Zetian a soul-searching question. "Your Majesty, between an aunt and a nephew, and a mother and a son, who is closer? If you enthrone your son, after 1,000 autumns, he will set up a spirit tablet for you in the ancestral temple, allowing you to enjoy the sacrifices of future generations. But if you enthrone your nephew, have you ever heard of a nephew, after becoming emperor, inviting his aunt into the ancestral temple for worship?" This question completely shattered Wu Zetian's psychological defenses. As a ruler, What she cared about most, besides power in life, was posthumous glory and historical status. Direnjie made her understand that only a son could guarantee her status as a mother would be eternally revered after her death. But Direngie's wisdom didn't stop there. He knew that to succeed, persuading the Empress alone was not enough. He also had to manage another powerful force in the palace, the Zhang brothers. If the Zhang brothers interfered, the plan could still fail. So, Direnjie sent his trusted aide, Ji Shu, to privately persuade Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong. Ji Shu's argument to the Zhang brothers was entirely from their own self-interested perspective. He said, "You two gentlemen are currently in high favor. But have you considered what will happen after the Empress passes away? Who will be your support then? If a Wu nephew becomes emperor, you will also be relatives by marriage. Will he tolerate you? You might end up with no place to be buried. But if you act now and help restore the Prince of Luling, Li Xian, he will be the future emperor. You will have done him a great service by enthroning him. In the future, how could he not be grateful to you and protect your wealth and status?" These words were a revelation to the Zhang brothers. They realized that supporting Li Xian was their only way to save themselves. So, they also began to advocate for returning the government to the sun in front of Wu Zetian. Thus, under Direngie's careful planning, the internal and external forces reached a consensus. In 698 AD, Wu Zetian finally made up her mind, secretly sending for her exiled son Li Xian and re-establishing him as the crown prince. Watching all this, you felt a surge of admiration for Direnjie. He did not try to oppose the Empress's power with his own principles, like Wei Yuanzhong. He chose to understand the Empress's desires and fears, and then perfectly combined his goal with her deepest need, the craving for immortal fame. He was not fighting, he was guiding. He used the softest method to achieve the most difficult political turn, preserving a glimmer of hope for the nearly overturned Tang dynasty. Of course, later Confucian historians always portrayed Direnjie as an absolutely loyal minister who was in the Zhou court but with his heart in the Tang, a hero who single-handedly restored the Tang. But some historians believe this view is too simplistic. Direnjie was first and foremost a clear-headed, pragmatic politician. His insistence on welcoming back Li Xian was perhaps not just out of loyalty to the Li Tang, but because he keenly foresaw that if the succession issue was not resolved, the empire would inevitably plunge into a bloody civil war between the Wu and Li clans upon Wu Zetian's death. Everything he did was to avoid greater turmoil and ensure a smooth transition for the empire. Whatever his motives, this maneuver was undoubtedly the most brilliant chapter of his political career and laid the decisive groundwork for the final curtain of the Wuzhou dynasty. Crown Prince Li Xian had returned, and the hearts of the court and the country seemed to have settled for the time being. But being in the palace, you could feel an even more bizarre and unsettling atmosphere, because everyone could see that the once formidable and energetic Empress was truly old. You saw her less and less. She began to fall ill frequently, her body growing weaker by the day. She spent most of her time in her bedchamber, the hall of longevity, and rarely attended court. Sometimes, even when she managed to attend, she appeared exhausted. The powerful aura that once made everyone afraid to look at her directly was slowly dissipating. And as the Empress weakened, The power of the Zhang brothers, Yiji and Changzong, reached an unprecedented and pathological peak. Because the Empress was unwell and unwilling to see outside ministers, the brothers became her sole channel of communication with the outside world. All memorials had to pass through their hands before being presented to the Empress. All edicts were also conveyed by them. They became the de facto power brokers. You looked at them and felt they were like two mayflies clinging to the last ray of late summer sun, engaged in a final, frantic carnival. They knew their support could collapse at any moment, so they desperately used this last bit of time to secure benefits for themselves. They openly sold official posts, accepted bribes, and appointed their cronies. Their mansions were more luxurious than those of princes. Their arrogance was more blatant than ever. The entire court fell into a terrible state of paralysis. The officials didn't know who to listen to. The chancellors? Their words might never reach the Empress's ears. The Zhang brothers? Who knew how much of the edicts they conveyed were their own fabrications? And the nominal heir, Crown Prince Li Xian, was even more timid and cautious, treating the Zhang brothers with utmost respect, not daring to offend them in the slightest. Amidst this political depression and unease, you also noticed some strange people appearing in the palace. They were Taoist priests, so-called alchemists. They were introduced into the palace by the Zhang brothers, claiming they could concoct elixirs of immortality for Her Majesty. The pursuit of eternal life is an eternal dream of ancient emperors. Wu Zetian was no exception, especially in her old age as her vitality waned. This desire became even stronger. You saw these alchemists setting up cauldrons in the palace, using various mysterious minerals and herbs to create colorful pills. They claimed these pills could solidify the elixir and prolong life. But behind this lay a deadly danger. You heard an old imperial physician whisper that many of these so-called immortality pills contained highly toxic ingredients such as cinnabar, mercury sulfide, and arsenic. They believed that these stable, non-corrosive metals could transfer their immortal properties to the person who consumed them. In today's view, this is absurd and suicidal. But at the time, countless nobles and aristocrats firmly believed in it. It is said that several emperors in the Tang dynasty died from this kind of elixir poisoning. You looked at the immortality pills being carefully delivered to the Empress's bedchamber, and a cold chill ran through you. This woman who had ruled the empire for nearly half a century, in the final moments of her life, could not escape the ordinary person's fear of death. Her fervent pursuit of immortality, intertwined with the Zhang brothers' frantic grasp at their last carnival of power, created a grotesque picture of the impending doom of the Wuzhou dynasty. Historians' records of this period are full of contradictions. Some records, especially those from the hands of the later coup plotters, portray the Zhang brothers as treacherous ministers who completely controlled the Empress and usurped state power. But some scholars believe that Wu Zetian, even on her deathbed, was still clear-headed. She might have been physically unable to move, but she still firmly controlled the situation through the Zhang brothers as her gloves. The Zhang brothers' actions were likely carried out with her tacit approval or even at her behest. But in any case, a fatal mistake had been made. The Zhang brothers, in order to monopolize power, had isolated the Empress from the outside world. They thought that by controlling the only channel to the Empress, they controlled everything. But they did not realize that this also blocked all other channels for the Empress to obtain real information. She became a solitary figure wrapped in an information cocoon. She could no longer hear the harsh but honest advice of people like Wei Wanzhong, nor see the well-intentioned reminders of people like Di Renjie. She and her favorites had become an isolated island. And outside this island, a huge storm aimed at overthrowing them all was quietly gathering. The calm before the storm is the most terrifying. In early 705 AD, the Empress's illness worsened, and she had been unable to attend court for several days. The Zhang brothers stood by her sickbed, never leaving her side, completely cutting off internal and external communication. The court ministers had not seen the Empress for several months. A sense of panic spread among the bureaucracy. They feared not only the Zhang brothers' monopoly on power, but also the uncertainty of the future. Everyone knew the Empress's end was near. What would happen once she passed away? Would the Zhang brothers hold the dying Empress hostage, forge a will, depose Crown Prince Li Xian, and usurp the throne themselves? Or would they, in a desperate move, strike first and assassinate the Crown Prince and key court ministers? Under such high pressure, waiting became the most dangerous option. Inaction was more dangerous than action. A secret alliance quietly formed among several of the empire's highest-ranking officials. The leader of this conspiracy was the then-chancellor, Zhang Jianji. He was an old man, nearly 80, who had weathered the ups and downs of official life and witnessed Wu Zetian's entire reign. He was not an impulsive young man. His decision was carefully considered. He allied with several other key ministers who deeply detested the Zhang brothers, such as Kui Xuanwei, Jing Hui, Huan Yanfan, and Yuan Shuji. They were the empire's elite, staunch defenders of the traditional bureaucratic system. You, as a low-level attendant delivering documents in the palace, could occasionally catch a hint of something unusual from the hushed words and tense expressions of their trusted officials. You heard them in a remote corner, in the lowest voices, discussing the crisis of the state and the safety of the Crown Prince. Every word was like a clap of thunder. Their plan was bold and meticulous. First, they had to win the support of the military. They secretly contacted the commanders of the royal guards, the left and right Yulinwei generals Li Duozuo and Li Jun. These two generals were also dissatisfied with the Zhang brothers' arrogance and quickly joined the conspiracy. Everything was ready, except for the most crucial element, the attitude of Crown Prince Li Xian. Without the Crown Prince's approval, their actions would be pure rebellion, lacking legitimacy and broad support. So, on a snowy night, Zhang Jianji and the others took a huge risk and secretly entered the Eastern Palace to meet with Crown Prince Li Xian. You can imagine Li Xian's fear and hesitation at that moment. He had lived his entire life in his mother's shadow. He had been made emperor, then deposed by his mother, exiled for years, then recalled by his mother. His character had long been worn down to be timid and suspicious. Now, these ministers wanted him to nod, to launch a coup against his mother's most trusted favorites. This was tantamount to asking him to poke a hornet's nest. Historical records say that Li Xian initially refused. He told Zhang Jianji, "The two Zhangs have done me a service," referring to their help in his restoration, "and I cannot bear to act against them. Besides, the Empress is gravely ill. To launch a coup at this time might disturb her. It would be better to wait until she recovers and then discuss it." Zhang Jianji knelt on the ground, tearfully pleading with him. Your Highness, you only remember the small favor of the two Zhangs. But have you forgotten the great cause of the Li Tang dynasty? When Emperor Gaozong was on his deathbed, to whom did he entrust you? Now the two Zhangs are bringing disaster to the country. The world is in turmoil, and the people's hearts are with the Tang. We are risking our lives today to restore the state. The opportunity is fleeting. If our plan is leaked, we will surely be crushed. But Your Highness and the entire Li Tang dynasty will be doomed forever. Under the earnest persuasion of Zhang Jianji and the others, Li Xian finally, with tears in his eyes, nodded. He agreed. With the Crown Prince's authorization, this coup transformed from a rebellion into a righteous act of clearing the monarch's side. This coup is known in history as the Shenlong coup, because after Li Xian's restoration, the new era name was Shenlong. Later historians have had different views on the nature of this coup. The official histories, of course, portray Zhang Jianji and the others as loyal ministers who saved the Li Tang dynasty. But some scholars point out that behind this were complex factional struggles. After overthrowing their common enemy, the Zhang brothers, these ministers soon turned against each other due to disputes over the spoils of victory. So, this might not have been a simple confrontation between loyalty and treachery, but a more realistic power shuffle. In any case, the arrow was on the bowstring and had to be released. On a night in the first month of 705 AD, within the palace city of Luoyang, danger lurked. A bloody drama that would change history was about to unfold. February 20th, 705 AD, at night. The divine capital, Luoyang Damming Palace. You were on duty late into the night, about to change shifts and rest, when a sudden burst of chaotic and hurried footsteps, mixed with the metallic clang of weapons, echoed through the palace city. Your heart tightened. You knew something was wrong. Zhang Jianji, Kui Xuanwei, and others, leading 500 well-prepared Yulinwei soldiers, rushed into the palace city from the Xuanwu Gate under the cover of darkness. Their target was clear and direct, the Chengsheng Hall where the Empress resided. You hid in the shadow of a colonnade, watching teams of soldiers armed with swords and spears, their faces filled with murderous intent, run past you. The eunuchs and palace maids scattered in terror, their screams and cries filling the air. The entire imperial palace, once a tranquil paradise, instantly transformed into a bloody slaughterhouse. The soldiers first surrounded the Yingxian courtyard, where the Zhang brothers, Yiji and Changzong, lived. The sleeping brothers were awakened, and before they could react, were dragged from their beds by the wolf-like soldiers. You didn't see the scene yourself, but you heard the piercing screams from a distance. You later learned that Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong were beheaded on the spot in the corridor of the Changsheng Hall. Their other brothers, Zhang Changqi, Zhang Tongxiu, and others, were also found and executed during the chaos. The once invincible Fengchen Fu, that magnificent and decadent center of power, became a river of blood overnight. The Lotus Liu Lang and his brother, who once made all the court officials look up to them, ended their short and absurd lives in an extremely tragic way. The next day, their heads were hung high on the Tianjin Bridge at the south gate of Luoyang for 3 days as a public display. This was the victor's declaration to the world. The era of the Zhang brothers was completely over. You watched the soldiers, their swords still dripping with blood, surround Zhang Jianji and the others as they headed towards the Empress's bedchamber. You held your breath, knowing the most critical and thrilling scene was about to unfold. They burst into the Changsheng Hall. On her sickbed, Wu Zetian was awakened. Though you were far away, you could imagine the expression on the face of this woman, over 80 years old, who had weathered countless storms in her life as she saw these armed ministers. Historical records say she sat up and looked coldly at Zhang Jianji, asking, "Who is causing this rebellion?" Zhang Jianji replied, "Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong were plotting a rebellion. We have executed them under the Crown Prince's order. Fearing a leak, we dared not report to your Majesty first." Wu Zetian looked at her pale-faced son, Li Xian, standing behind the crowd, and understood everything. She said to Zhang Jianji and the others, "Since you have already killed them, you may return to the Crown Prince's side." Her words carried a hint of weariness, but also an unquestionable authority. But Zhang Jianji and the others did not retreat. They knelt on the ground and stated their true purpose. "The Crown Prince has rendered great service to the state, and it is the will of heaven. We implore your Majesty to abdicate in favor of the Crown Prince, to follow the will of heaven and the people." This was the final ultimatum. You could almost feel the air in the bedchamber freeze. Wu Zetian was silent for a long time. She looked at these ministers who had once bowed to her, at the son she could once depose at will. She knew her time was up. The empire of power she had built over half a century had collapsed on this very night. Finally, she agreed. The next day, Wu Zetian issued an edict, announcing her abdication in favor of Crown Prince Li Xian. Li Xian ascended the throne as Emperor Zhongzong. The third day, Zhongzong led the officials to bestow upon Wu Zetian the honorary title of Zetian Dasheng Huangdi, Great Sage Emperor Zetian. The title Emperor preserved her final dignity. A few days later, the state name Zhou was abolished and restored to Tang. The dynasty founded by Wu Zetian, which had existed for 15 years, thus vanished into the river of history. For later historians, these 15 years seemed like a brief, inglorious interlude in the glorious Tang dynasty. There are no detailed records in the history books about what Wu Zetian said or thought at the moment she was forced to abdicate. This has left a huge space for later generations to imagine. Was she forced? Of course. But did she resist hysterically? Or did she, with the final calm of a top politician, accept this irreversible outcome? We do not know. But one thing is certain. The bloodshed of this coup was not just to eliminate two favorites. Behind it was a thorough, ritualistic restoration of order. The death of the Zhang brothers symbolized the end of a power model dependent on a female monarch, which was considered abnormal by the Confucian scholar officials. Their blood cleansed the court and also washed away the shame in the hearts of those men, reestablishing what they believed to be the only correct patriarchal order. After the storm, everything fell silent, a deathly quiet. The imperial palace, in your eyes, seemed to have changed hands overnight. The favorites and confidants who once surrounded Wu Zetian were either killed or exiled. The court was now filled with the new nobles, led by Zhang Jianji, Jing Hui, and others. They were the heroes of the coup and the most trusted men of the new emperor, Tang Zhongzong. And the woman who once made the entire empire tremble, the great sage emperor Zetian, was now respectfully moved to another palace, the Shangyang Palace. You had heard of this place. Although it was magnificent, in the eyes of the palace staff, it was usually a place for out-of-favor, elderly concubines. It was a comfortable, yet isolated cage. Once, she had locked countless opponents in such cages. Now, it was her turn. She was no longer the emperor. Although she retained the honorary title of Great Sage Emperor Zetian, it was just an empty, ceremonial title. She was stripped of all power, with only a few palace maids and eunuchs to attend to her daily needs. You no longer saw the grand scene of officials paying homage, nor did you hear rumors of her making decisions on state affairs. She had become a living but dethroned idol. Once the new emperor, Tang Zhongzong, her son Li Xian, led the officials to the Shangyang Palace to pay their respects. You watched the procession from afar, filled with emotion. The son she once treated like a chess piece was now wearing the dragon robe, the master of the world. And the ministers who once trembled before her were now visiting their former monarch as victors. You can imagine how awkward and tense the atmosphere in that room must have been. The son looked at the mother who had once deposed him, and the mother looked at the son who had overthrown her. Between monarch and subject, mother and son, the unspeakable grudges, schemes, affections, and betrayals were all condensed in that respectfully offered cup of tea. Historical records say that when Zhongzong and the ministers saw the ailing Wu Zetian, they all knelt and danced, performing the grand ceremony, and then wept bitterly. How much of those tears was genuine emotion, and how much was political performance? From then on, Wu Zetian's health declined at a visible rate. Perhaps it was the torment of illness. But you were more inclined to believe that the immense sense of loss from falling from the pinnacle of power had completely destroyed her will. For someone who regarded power as life itself, losing power was equivalent to losing her soul. She was like an oil lamp that, after a final struggle, quickly burned out. In the winter of 705 AD, the same year as the Shenlong coup, in the 11th month, Wu Zetian passed away in the Jianzhu Hall of the Shangyang Palace, ending her legendary and controversial life at the age of 82. Before her death, she left a will, requesting to be enshrined in the ancestral temple, returned to the imperial tomb, her imperial title removed, and to be called the Great Sage Empress Zetian. This meant she voluntarily gave up her status as emperor and chose to return to the Li Tang ancestral temple as the Empress of Emperor Gaozong, to be buried with her husband. This final decision was full of complex meanings. Was it her final compromise with the male-dominated world, or was it her final return to her husband as a wife? Or was it, as a mother, her final political arrangement for her son and the stability of the Li Tang dynasty? Historians have different interpretations of this. Some believe it was a manifestation of her political realism. She knew her Zhou dynasty could not continue. So rather than letting future generations argue endlessly, she chose to return voluntarily, seeking the most stable outcome for her posthumous affairs. But others believe that behind this lay her deep helplessness and unwillingness. She had fought her whole life, broken all the rules, and reached the pinnacle of power. But in the end, she had to return to the traditional role of Empress that had been set for her. In any case, her death marked the complete end of an era. The woman who had once inspired fear, jealousy, and admiration in countless men, the one and only female emperor in Chinese history, was gone. And those who overthrew her did not find peace after her death. They soon fell into a new round of infighting, and most did not meet a good end. The game of power continued, just with a new set of players. At the end of the story, let's leave the palace filled with intrigue and bloodshed and go to a more open, more eternal place. In your imagination, you have come to Mount Liang, northwest of the city of Chang'an. Here lies a unique imperial tomb in Chinese history, the Chunling Mausoleum. It is unique because it is the joint tomb of two emperors, Emperor Gaozong of Tang, Li Ji, and his Empress, who later became an emperor herself, Wu Zetian. You walk slowly along the long spirit path towards the mausoleum. On both sides of the path stand huge stone figures of men and horses, including mighty generals and humble civil officials. The most striking are the 61 life-sized stone statues. They are the 61 foreign vassal statues, representing the foreign envoys and tribal leaders who came to Chang'an to mourn Emperor Gaozong. These silent stone figures wordlessly tell of the former strength and glory of the Tang Empire, a glory that Wu Zetian helped create and push to its peak. You walk past this forest of stone statues and arrive in front of the mausoleum. Here, you see two massive stone steles facing each other. The one on the west is called the Stele of the Sage's Deeds, densely inscribed with over 7,000 characters, written by Wu Zetian herself, praising the civil and military achievements of her husband, Emperor Gaozong. And the one on the east is the end of our story today, and also the biggest puzzle Wu Zetian left to the world, the wordless stele. You stand before it, struck by its immense size and emptiness. It is a huge stone, nearly 8 meters tall, carved with exquisite dragon and phoenix patterns. But the body of the stele is smooth, without a single word. In a tradition where emperors were eager to carve all their achievements on steles to be remembered for eternity, such a wordless stele seems so abrupt and incredible. Why did she do this? For over 1,000 years, people have speculated, with 4 main theories emerging. The first theory is that her merits and virtues were too great to be described in words. Proponents of this view believe that Wu Zetian felt her life's achievements far surpassed those of any previous emperor. She believed that a mere stone stele could not bear the weight of her greatness. Any words would seem pale in comparison to her accomplishments. So, she left it blank, wanting heaven and earth to write for her, for history to judge her. This is a form of extreme confidence and pride. The second theory is the exact opposite. She knew her sins were too great to write. This view suggests that in her later years, Wu Zetian felt some remorse for the cruel political struggles of her life, for the slaughter of the Li Tang imperial family. She knew she was a controversial figure, her merits and demerits difficult to judge. Rather than writing them down to be defaced and spat upon, it was better to write nothing, leaving a blank slate for others to comment on. This is a complex, guilt-tinged frankness. The third theory is more realistic and full of political wisdom. This view holds that Wu Zetian knew that after her death, history would be written by her enemies, the Confucian scholar officials. If she had filled the stele with praises of herself, later rulers, especially those who hated her, would likely order the inscription to be ground off, or even carve insulting words on it. Rather than suffer such humiliation, it was better to write nothing from the start, leaving them with no place to start. This is a clever, defensive move of retreating to advance. And the fourth theory, which is my personal favorite, is that she left it as a final challenge to posterity. It is said that in her will, she once said, "My achievements and errors must be evaluated by later generations." It seems she wanted to use this wordless stele to ask all future ages, "How will you judge me?" She seemed to believe that historical evaluation would change with the times. She was unwilling to draw a final conclusion on her life with a definitive statement. She chose to give the right of judgment to each and every one of us. Interestingly, although Wu Zetian wanted her stele to be wordless, later generations did not fully respect her wish. Starting from the Song and Jin dynasties, many scholars, poets, and officials, when visiting the Qianling mausoleum, would inscribe poems and essays on her wordless stele, expressing their thoughts. Over time, this wordless stele became a worded stele, covered layer by layer with the writings of later generations. You stand before this stele that has weathered 1,000 years of wind and rain, as if you can see the shadows of people from countless eras stopping, gazing, and contemplating here. This stele is like a microcosm of Wu Zetian's own historical image. Her true, complex face has long been covered and smeared by later narratives full of prejudice and imagination. She has become a symbol. Every era projects its own views on power, ambition, and women onto her story. Was she a wise monarch or a cruel dictator? A feminist pioneer who broke the shackles of her time, or a tragic woman alienated by power? Perhaps the answer lies in this wordless stele. It is silent, yet it speaks volumes. It invites us to write. And it also reminds us that any writing may just be a reflection of our own time. Now, the night is deep. Let's leave these heavy historical puzzles to this silent stone. The night, like gentle ink, slowly spreads over the flying eaves of the palace, over the ancient city walls. The once thrilling stories, the once vivid faces, the arrogant Shui Huaiyi, the handsome Zhang brothers, the wise Di Renji, and that lonely yet powerful Empress, all begin to fade in your mind, becoming blurry, as if seen through a thin veil of a dream. You can almost still smell the faint scent of aloes wood in the air, still hear the rustling sound of silk robes, and still see the flickering light of palace lanterns on the smooth floor. But all of this has become distant and serene. You no longer need to ask what should be written on that wordless stele, nor do you need to judge the rights and wrongs of the love and hatred in the deep palace. All the answers are no longer important. At this moment, you are just a weary traveler, pausing by the long river of history. Now, it is time to continue your own journey into that deeper, more tranquil dreamland. Let all the complicated thoughts, like reflections in the water, slowly disperse, disappear, and return to a peaceful darkness. End of story. Good night.